Okay, we're up to the 10th principle of Jewish, I would say, commitment, because, as you know, I don't like the word faith. And that is, Rambam says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows the actions of people. And he doesn't hide his eye from them. Now, it's a funny contrast. He knows, he doesn't hide his eye from them. In other words, that he can know, that's for sure, but you might have thought that he has other things to do, or he has some reason for not knowing, and he doesn't do that either. Not like the opinion of those who say, Ozav Hashem ha'aretz, Hashem abandoned the earth. But rather, like the verse in Yirmiyahu, Gottleib eitzav rav ha'aliyah, she'einecha pkuchos al kol darchei b'nei adam. Great in counsel and great in strategy, that your eyes are open to observe all the ways of people. And before the flood, Hashem saw that man's evil was great in the land, and the outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great. These verses show the truth of the 10th principle, that Hashem knows the actions of people. Now, the Rambam is not operating in a vacuum here. There were some who said, in his period, Arabic philosophy was very active. There were some who said that man is too insignificant for the creator of the universe to pay attention to, and certainly in detail. There was an even more radical philosophy, which he quotes in the Torah, which said that God can't know physical particulars. Because the way you know the color of this table, or the size of that house, or the strength of iron, is by observing it. And since the Creator is not a physical being at all, and therefore the physical being has no sense organs like eyes and ears and tactile sense and the rest, these are not items that he can know. We can understand that the Creator has a mind, and with a mind he can know categories and logic and calculation and so forth and so on. But what we call physical particulars, he can't know because he hasn't got the right capacities to know things like that. Concerning this issue, there's a famous, should be famous, Ibn Ezra, with the Sodom and Gomorrah, where God says, I'm going to check to see whether they've done exactly what I've heard. And he says this, Hakol yeda kol Helek al derech kol, v'lo al derech Helek. The all knows every part, but not in the way that parts know parts, but in the way that the whole knows parts. Which, as is often the case with Ibn Ezra, it's sort of mysterious poetry, and you're supposed to figure it out on your own. But the straightforward starting point is, Kadosh Baruch Hu is everything, and you're talking about physical particulars, which are parts, and there's a way in which one physical particular knows another physical particular. That's how a part knows a part. That's through sense organs, that's true. But God, being the whole, can know the part in a way that's appropriate for a whole, and not for a part. The fact that God can't know a part the way other parts know parts doesn't mean he can't know them. There's another way to know. A similar idea is found in the Moreh Nevuchim, where the Rambam is half answering a question. This isn't his final word on the subject, but he's half answering the question, and he makes the following analogy. Imagine you have a complex machine, let's say like a microscope with reflecting mirrors and light sources and different lenses and so forth and so on. Now, maybe you've never seen something like that before. So you take a look and you turn it on, the light goes on, you switch the lenses around, and what does it have to do with this, Does it play Beethoven? I said, it's just glass here. I'll look through, look at that. Wow, you turn this around, get a different view, and you come to experience to be able to know what it does, more or less. It might have some things that it does that you didn't think of trying out, and you wouldn't know everything, but you know a lot about it. Now, let's contrast that with the designer of the microscope. He designed it. He dictated how it should be built. He doesn't have to test it to see what it'll do, assuming the engineering is good, because he designed it to do certain things. He knows from his plan that it should be made what it will do. He doesn't have to learn it by observation. So that's how you see that two people can know something from a very different point of view, from a very different perspective. When you come across it as an item in your world, you need to experiment with it and gather experience of it in order to get a picture of what it does. And the designer has the understanding without any of that. So that's the partial refutation of the idea that God can't know particulars because he doesn't have sense organs. The Rambam is definitely opposing that point of view. And what I've told you now, has nothing particular to do with the actions of man. But the Rambam makes this principle be talking specifically about the actions of man. Well, the actions of man are special because they're subject to a particular problem. What the sea does and how hard granite it is and so forth and so on doesn't present this problem. But the actions of man with free will present a problem. And here the Rambam, as he's told us at the beginning, is just stating the principle, but he discusses this at great length elsewhere. I will let you into some of the back and forth on it. He doesn't mention it here, but he mentions it elsewhere. God's knowledge is perfect. God doesn't change. God doesn't learn new things. So that means that if God knows all the actions of man, it means he knows them before they happen. So let's imagine the following situation. This is the Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva. I'm making a decision now. Shall I raise my hand or shall I not? When I go through this, sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. 4, 3, 2, 1. Up! Okay, this time I went up. I decided to raise my hand. He asked me what happened. I said, listen, I've done this before. Sometimes I raise it, sometimes I keep it down. Both are under my control. Both are within my abilities. I choose one, and that's what happens. That's the way it seems to me, and to you, of course, and to all of you who are watching the video, of course. Don't play philosophy when, and after the third martini. You all experience your active lives this way. Now, along comes the critic, and he says, are you religious? I'd say, would I be wearing this hat if I weren't religious? He says, okay, you believe God knows everything? Yes. You believe he always knew everything? Yes. So you mean that you believe yesterday he already knew that you were going to pick up your hand today? Yes. Well then, Rabbi, tell me, if yesterday he knew that you were going to pick up your hand today, could you really have left it down? Were you really able to do that? Was that really a possibility for you? Think, Rabbi, if you leave your hand down, you would be contradicting what God knew yesterday. Do you really have the power to contradict what God knows? Is God's knowledge in your hands that you could make God's knowledge incorrect? Surely God's knowledge is perfect. God's knowledge is incorrigible. It's absolute. So you can't even say that you had the power to leave your hand down if yesterday God knew that you were going to pick it up. Now notice carefully what the problem is, because people confuse this with something else, which is not the problem. We're saying here, in my experience, I had two openings, two possibilities, two alternatives. I chose one. And that's why that one happened. The other one was possible, I just didn't choose it. The critic is attacking the other one being possible. His focus is on the one I didn't do. He's not pretending that God's knowledge made me lift my hand. That's not his critique. That's a separate issue, yes or no. He's telling me, listen, you thought you had two alternatives. That's what you think makes it free, because there were two things I could do, and I chose one. Free, we sometimes call it free choice. And that, according to your own picture, Gottleib, that's not true, because if you knew yesterday you're going to pick it up, the other alternative, leaving it down, wasn't real. It wasn't a real alternative, because to have left your hand down would have meant to contradict his knowledge. That's the challenge, the challenge of what's called foreknowledge and free will. You have a question?
No, not yet.
Okay. So now the question, the problem is what to do about that question. There are two ways of responding. I used to think there were four. And a few years ago, I read a tshuva of the Rivosh on the subject, which is brought in the Maor commentary this commentary on the Rambam's work. And it changed my mind entirely, because the Rivosh, no surprise, is a much better philosopher than I am. And there are really only two solutions, two responses. And I'll show you both of them. I'll explain to you how they work. The first is to say that the critic has slipped in an extra assumption under the table. Very common for critics to do that. And he didn't tell you about it, didn't advertise it. And if you question it, then you could wiggle out of his argument. But let me go through the argument again and show you where the slipping in takes place. So I was choosing between picking up my hand and leaving it down, and I chose to pick it up. God knows everything and knew everything yesterday. So yesterday he knew I was going to pick it up. Okay. Now we ask, what would it mean for me to leave my hand down instead of picking it up? Leaving my hand down would contradict his knowledge yesterday. And that's impossible. So at this point, let's just describe the situation in a little more detail. We live in a world, the real world, the world where things happen. What actually happened is my hand went up, and yesterday God knew my hand was going up. When we ask about leaving my hand down, we're not talking about this world anymore, because in this world my hand went up. We're talking about the viability of a virtual world, different from this world, in which I leave my hand down. Is there anything somehow problematic or tension-filled or maybe contradictory about a virtual world in which instead of going up, it stays down? That's what the critic has to address. What about the viability of that virtual world, which didn't happen, where I leave my hand down? Now here's the critique. Well, see, in that virtual world, where you leave your hand down, you have to ask, what in that virtual world does God know yesterday in that world? Okay, let's ask. And he says, well, in that world he knew your hand was going up. Really? Why? Well, because in this world he knew your hand was going up. Really? But they're two different worlds. Just like in that world, we're imagining my hand stays down as against in this world where it went up. Why couldn't we imagine that in that world, God's knowledge yesterday is that my hand stays down? Why are you transferring God's knowledge yesterday from this world to that world when you're talking about a different world? Who gave you the right to do that? What grounds do you have for doing that? And I don't think he has an answer. Well, he could have a kind of abstract answer at the end, but on the surface, he needs to fill that gap in order to enforce his contradiction. Now let me say that's pure logic. Now let me say it with a little more detail. Bertrand Russell said this in a book about religion, and he said, don't try to beat up the religious believer with this example because it's a dumb example. And he raises the following point. Okay, God knows. We didn't ask how God knows. How does God get his knowledge? Here's a suggestion. God got his knowledge yesterday of what I'm going to do today because God took a sneak peek at what I do today. Even yesterday, he could see what I do today. We can't see into the future? Okay, we're not God. He can. So yesterday, he observes what I'm doing today, and that's how he gets the knowledge that I picked my hand up. If that's the model, let's now think about the virtual world. In the virtual world, I leave my hand down. What's God going to know yesterday in the virtual world? That my hand is down, because he peeks ahead and sees what's going to happen the next day in that world. And in that world, I leave my hand down. And then it becomes perfectly consistent. So what the critic has done is he's sneaked God's knowledge from this world to that world and then created a contradiction, but he has no logical right to do that. The bottom line here is this. It's a question of how God gets the knowledge of human actions. And if he gets them by, so to speak, observing them, then of course, if you did something different, he would know something different. And now it comes out, according to the Rivash, that making it yesterday really has nothing to do with the argument. It just makes it, how shall I say, convincing, because you naturally assume that what happens yesterday can't be the result of what you do today. Causation works forward in time, not backward in time. That's a natural feeling we have about that. Cause has to come first, the effect comes second. We have a natural feeling about that. But it's only a natural feeling. Philosophy does not agree that that's a necessity. And in some cases in physics, John Wheeler and I want to name Richard Feynman, both think that there are particle interactions where the cause is later in time and the effect is earlier in time. So we can't just rely on, oh, gosh, I can't imagine boiling an egg before I heat the water. That's not going to do it. And if the knowledge depends upon the action, then when you imagine the possibility of doing a different action, of course, you'll have to imagine that the knowledge is different. And when the knowledge is different, that means it's going to be consistent. It's not going to be a problem at all. Now, this way, is your hand up?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Isn't the critic making a faulty assumption that the perfect knowledge is knowledge of an outcome as opposed to being knowledge of all possible outcomes as the attribute of God? Not to understand what the outcome will be, but what all possible outcomes could be, inclusive of what will be.
I think it's an assumption, but it's not an incorrect assumption at all, because if this knowledge that you're describing, the knowledge of all possible outcomes and all their effects and so on and so on, all the paths down which history could go, so to speak, right? It leaves out which one's going to happen, which is also a fact.
Yeah.
And it leaves that one out. So that does mean perfect knowledge will not tolerate that missing fact. It's not enough just to know all possible outcomes, because there is a fact then that isn't known, at least at that time, by God.
Can you repeat that, please?
Okay, let's say that a person is in a room with two doors, and there are only two doors in the room, and they're rigged. One is rigged with a bomb, and the other is an exit to the outside. So we say we know exactly what, if he opens this door, he's going to be dead. If he opens that door, he's going to be outside. Okay, they allow him to make the choice at 4 o'clock. it's now 4:30, we haven't been there and so forth and so on. Something happened. What happened? Well, I don't know. If he took this door, then he's dead. And if he took that door, he's outside. I know both possibilities, but isn't there also a fact of where he is now, 4:30? What about that fact, where he actually is? Not where he could have been and what would have happened and so forth and so on.
Yes.
Okay, and now, if you're God, you got to know that fact at 3 o'clock also. Because it's a fact about the world.
Yes, I agree. Yeah.
So I can't be content with just knowing all possibilities.
But then that means he knows all possibilities of he has knowledge of all possibilities of all possibilities.
But that won't help here. There are possibilities, and then there are realities.
Yes, but realities are inclusive within all possibilities.
Yes, but they're set aside as the ones that happen, as opposed to all the other possibilities that don't happen. That's part of the information about the world.
But then the knowledge includes the reality as well as the possibilities, and that's what would constitute.
But it includes them with separate labels. It doesn't include them because then you don't know something that is true, namely that this one is the realized one and that's the unrealized one.
They have separate labels, but they still fall within the box of creation. So he has perfect knowledge of what's happening within creation because all those possibilities are within creation, and the reality is also in creation.
Of course.
So that would be the perfect knowledge. It's the reality as well as all the possibilities that could have happened as well.
That's right. But once you put the realities into the knowledge, then you have the problem the critic is raising, right?
Well, then you just get a new set of possibilities and then realities as someone makes a decision. So if you make a decision, if you're in the room, it's not that you can go.
But you don't need that. You don't have to go so far. When a person passes the age of 65, he can't work anymore because the law says he's got to retire. He didn't do anything. He just ticked off the days on the calendar, and things change. Things change in their qualities and their relationships without action.
Well, if we go back to the example of the room, the two choices are to go through the two doors, but the person in the room could just as well lie down, and that's the choice they make. Well, they could sit, and these are different modes of actions that they're taking within the space, and so there are far more choices than the two doors. They could do a whole host of things.
We can easily eliminate that, right? He's starving to death.
Yeah, and these are all possibilities within that space.
But what does it make? The fact is that the time in which he's going to make the decision is 4 o'clock. It's now 4:30. We know he made one of the decisions. We just haven't been observing, so we don't know which one he made. But one of them he made, and that means either he's dead or he's outside.
Why would we assume that? Because he may have done something completely outside the realm of the choices that he has in front of him. He may have.
Okay. I mean, the point, you can do it with 25 choices. It doesn't make any difference. The point is, he's chosen one of the 25 choices, right?
Okay.
And all the 24 he didn't do. It doesn't make it's going to be 164. He can only do one thing, right?
Okay.
So all the others aren't done.
Okay.
And now it's at 4:30, and he did one of the 164, right? And if all I know is there were 164 and no other consequences, then there's a piece of information about the world that I don't have.
Yes.
Okay. Now, so God has to have that.
Yeah.
He has perfect knowledge. And he had to have it at 3 o'clock also, because his knowledge doesn't change.
Yes.
So now we're back in the same problem, right? At 3 o'clock, he knows what's going to happen, that it's going to happen, and then it seems like if it's a free decision, he's in trouble.
Yeah.
Okay, the critic's okay there. Now, I want to remark here, some people want to use the fact that God is outside of time to make this work. And the Rivash points out that has no effect whatsoever on the solution. God's being outside of time counts for nothing. It doesn't help at all. I know there's a Tosis Yom Tov who says the Rambam says so. I'm just quoting the Rivash. Because you have to ask the same question. First of all, if God's outside of time, don't say he knew yesterday. That puts him in time. So don't talk to him with time talk at all. Talk to him with neutral present tense verbs. And describe him in nouns. We talk about his knowledge. Not he knew, or knows, or will know. His knowledge. His knowledge includes all truth. Okay. So now, what is it that is responsible for his having that knowledge? In particular, is his knowledge a result of our doing what we do, or isn't it a result of our doing what we do? And if you say that his knowledge outside of time is a result of doing what we do, then there's no problem. When I raise my hand, his knowledge will include raising my hand because it's complete and perfect. If you imagine another virtual world in which I keep my hand down, then his knowledge in that world will include keeping my hand down because his knowledge is a result of what I do and it's complete and perfect. So it'll be perfectly consistent. If his knowledge is independent of my action, if it's somehow built into his very nature or whatever it is, then we're going to have trouble because really I picked up my hand. And really that means his knowledge being independent and perfect has picking up my hand because of the perfection of his knowledge. And is not dependent upon my action. Then if you imagine another world in which I were to keep my hand down, you have to keep the knowledge constant like the critic wanted. And then you would have a contradiction. So everything depends upon whether his knowledge is a feature, a function of my action or not. Now, I've taught this for many years, and a few years ago it occurred to me that there's a little bit of a support for this idea, and I'm mentioning this because the Rambam rejects this idea. There's a little bit of support for this idea in the fact that the phraseology that the verses use and that the rabbinical tradition uses to describe God's knowledge, in particular God's knowledge of man's actions, is all observational. It's all observational. I thought to myself, wow, that's really interesting. Look at the verbs, look at the verses that the Rambam brings. God's eyes are open to observe all the ways of man. God saw great was the evil of man in the earth. The cry of Sodom and Gomorrah has come before me. So he heard it. They're all verbs of observation. Well, that's quite remarkable. If that's the way the Tanakh chooses to describe HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Sofa umabit mi sofa olam at sofa olam. He observes and gazes at the world from one end to the other, say Chazal. Say Chazal. Sofa ma'aseh shel tzadikim. He saw the actions of the righteous and of the wicked. Sofa, he observed them. Har Sofim. All right. So this phraseology is very, very suggestive of this particular attitude. And I was thrilled about 2 months ago when I came across in the Maharal, in Divrei Chaim on Pirkei Avos, where he said exactly the same thing. He held like this position that what I described to you, and this is where you solve the problem of the critic. And he said the verbs in the written tradition, the oral tradition, are all verbs of observation, and that gives the impression that what HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows is a result of what we do, and that's, so in a certain sense, it's like HaKadosh Baruch Hu tracks things, and he tracks them perfectly, both for the accuracy and comprehensiveness. He tracks things perfectly. If you'll ask me, well, if he tracks it, then maybe that would mean he only comes to know it when it happens, and then there is a change in his knowledge. That's a good question. I think the answer is this: that we can't describe HaKadosh Baruch Hu really at all, ultimately, but we certainly can't describe HaKadosh Baruch Hu in his unity because he interacts with the world in too many different ways. The Zohar is replete with this idea that he's Mesabiv Kol Almin, Mamali Kol Almin. He surrounds all the worlds and he fills all the worlds. Transcendent and immanent, we would say it in philosophical terminology. You can't take all of the ways in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu operates with respect to the world and unite them in one. So you have to divide them up. So here's the idea. Number one, he's present at every space-time moment. He's present everywhere, everywhen, and therefore he can track whatever's going on perfectly. But then his essence, so to speak, he's a creator. He's the creator. He's not in the world. He's not part of the world. He creates the world. To do that, he's standing outside of the world. So I think you can envision it as a three-stage process. This is taking Bertrand Russell and putting it on steroids. He's present at the moment and in the space where I raised my hand. That creates the knowledge. Then that knowledge is available to his essence, so to speak, which is, as creator, transcends the whole of the creation. And then because it's available to the creator, so it transcends all of creation, it's then available to all moments of space-time where he's present, wherever they are, in my past or in my future or in Alaska or in Alpha Centauri, because all of them are expressions of that essence that's beyond time, beyond the world, the creation. So that being the case, it is true that my action today is responsible for his knowledge yesterday. That the knowledge that he gets yesterday, he gets from me. And contrary to popular wisdom. As I told you, the idea that cause comes first and effect comes second, philosophy for a couple of hundred years worked very hard to try to prove that and failed. And you know they failed. I'm not just criticizing them. And then, as I told you, Richard Feynman and John Wheeler at least say in certain particle interactions that it's because of what happens a little bit later that something happens earlier in the diagram. So that would mean in the physical world that sometimes the cause comes after the effect. And if that happens in the physical world, then certainly when you're describing the relationship of the creator to the world, the degrees of freedom there are gigantic. Right? You don't want to import what you experience about boiling eggs and hard boiling eggs in water to say how the creator can relate to the world. So I think that we're not on any seriously difficult ground there. That's one approach. That's a solution to the problem. Are we together so far? Okay, now the Rambam rejects this. In the Mishnah Torah, he raises the problem, and he says it's a very difficult problem, and it depends upon lots of fundamental principles and introductions, which I can't give you. The bottom line is, a Kodesh Baruch Hu can't be described, and his knowledge is no different from his essence, which we can't understand, and man has free will. That's what he says. In the Moreh Nevuchim, part 3, chapter 17, he reviews a number of schools of Arabic philosophy and criticizes them. And one of them, he says, these people believe that God knows everything, and man has free will, and a little thought will show to you the absolute contradiction between those two ideas. Period. So people who think that he was trying to express a solution to the problem in Mishnah Torah, absolutely not. He's not trying to solution. He's telling you that the problem as stated has no solution. And therefore he's taking a different approach. His approach, which is not based on this problem, his approach is that God's unity is absolute, sort of. Everything has to be further refined down the line. If you're going to take God's unity seriously and it's absolute, it means at least no number other than one can apply to him for any reason, any application, any environment, any dimension, any context whatsoever. Nothing about God can have a number other than one. I'm putting it negatively because later on he says not even one applies. But that's okay, that's going further than we're going now. Right? Now, for example, God can't be a physical object because physical objects have parts. You'll tell me there's some physical objects that don't have parts, like electrons and photons. Well, we don't know yet that they have parts, right? Nobody thought protons have parts either. But they have matter and form. Their existence is divisible into two dimensions. And that can't apply to Kodesh Baruch Hu either. Now, what about describing him? Well, if you're going to start describing him, there's going to be a bunch. He's all-knowing and all-powerful and just and merciful. And trustworthy, faithful and fulfills his promises, so on and so on, the descriptions are going to be legion. And then there's going to be more than one. It's going to be a description of his qualities. And his qualities require a number. And that can't be. So all description of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is off limits. If that's true, then we're not going to say he knows, because that's a description. And the problem we're facing is a contradiction between God's knowledge and free will. You only face that problem if you believe in both of them. If you believe God knows and you believe man has free will. But if you subtract God's knowing, then you don't have a problem, because there's no contradiction, because there's no knowledge to be contradictory to free will. So you say, yeah, but Rabbi, we're religious, I mean, how can we just subtract God's knowledge? We're going to understand God as ignorant? No, not really, because ignorant is another description. So if we're going to be serious about this and consistent about this, we're not going to say he knows, and we're not going to say he's ignorant. Oh, but Rabbi, is one or the other. Not with God. Not with a stone either. Stone doesn't know. A stone isn't ignorant either, is it? A stone isn't hairy. Is it therefore bald? No, stones aren't bald. Only mammals are bald. To be bald means you're missing your hair, right? Not always can you go from a term to its contrary and say one or the other has to apply. With respect to Kodesh Baruch Hu, we're not going to say anything. So we're not going to say that that he knows. We're not going to say that he's ignorant. Knowledge and ignorance isn't the sort of thing to raise vis-a-vis the Creator. He's beyond all description altogether. So that, in a formal sense, in a strict logical sense, defeats the problem. The critic is raising a contradiction between A and B. We don't believe A. But there are hundreds and hundreds, thousands of descriptions of God in the literature. What about all that literature? We're just going to throw it all out? A lot of it is the 1,000 pages of Tanakh, where there are many, many descriptions of God. What are we going to do with all that literature? How are we going to understand it? You got a question, Ben?
Yeah. I mean, for the lesson in the 10th principle seems to be more talking about awareness. I don't know.
No, I'm sorry. The words there are not blank awareness without a commitment. Two of them are eyes, right, and the other is hearing. There's sensory awareness. Yeah. So we're not going to attribute to God eyes and ears, but at the very least, eyes and ears pick up information from the world. Mm-hmm. And what happens in the world determines what information they pick up. That's what I want here, and that's what the Maharal says. Right? I mean, it's that his knowledge is a result of our acting. And if we had acted differently, his knowledge would be different. And that's what the solution says. Yeah, question?
Could we say that God experiences, or this is not giving him a description?
It certainly is giving a description. According to the Rambam, yeah. According to the Rambam, no, we're not going to say that at all. And strictly speaking, as I said, we're not going to say that he knows. Maybe I could put in here an observation that my son made. Now, in the Mishnah Torah, where he discusses this, he says we don't understand God's essence, and when God's knowledge is identical with his essence, so we can't understand his knowledge. So it's beyond understanding altogether. And then he uses the phraseology, we can't understand how he knows. So I thought, wait a second. That doesn't sound the same. First you're telling me we're not going to say he knows at all. Then you say he knows, we just don't understand how he knows. That doesn't sound the same. So my son explained it as follows. I think this is consistent with the Moreh Nevuchim. Am I 100% satisfied with this? 95%. If we delete knowing from God, and if we're careful not to draw the false conclusion that he must be ignorant, okay, we're not going to draw that conclusion either, but still we might wonder whether he's not missing something, because knowledge is very useful. And a being that didn't have knowledge, even if you wouldn't qualify it as ignorant, but if it didn't have knowledge, that would seem to be a big loss. So what the Rambam is saying is, God can do everything that knowledge does, but he doesn't do it through knowledge. He does it in another way. So he's not lacking any of the abilities that knowledge gives you. He just doesn't use knowledge to do it. So let me give a couple of analogies here, which will make the concept clear, I hope. They build a new multiplication machine, and they say this is the fastest thing that's ever been built. You put in two numbers, no matter how big they are. When you finish writing the second number, you get an instant answer. So programmers think, I wonder what kind of algorithm they're using, The bigger the numbers, the more computing that has to be done. They're telling me as soon as you finish filling in the numbers, you get the answer. Usually, even if it's microseconds, but the longer the number, the longer the time is going to be. And then you find out that what the computer does is it has a giant spreadsheet and it has a lookup program. One number is the row and one number is the column, and you get the one at the cross, right? It's not computing at all, not multiplying at all. No calculation is going on. Just a lookup program. Oh, I see that. Lookup programs, sure. You go down the column, you go over the rows, and you find where they meet. Then it won't make any difference how long the numbers are, because it's not doing it the way you thought. You thought it was multiplying. It's not multiplying, it's just looking up. So when you see something happen, that usually happens by a certain process, your mind has to be opened. You can get the same result from a very different process. That's the secret with phony AI. It's not artificial intelligence, it's artificial pseudo-intelligence. It sometimes gets you the answer that intelligence would give you, but it doesn't do it by using intelligence. Not even fallible intelligence, not even primitive intelligence. There's no intelligence there at all. See the items on my blog. And if you think it has intelligence, then you're in serious trouble, because you'll trust it much too much. To realize everything that it gives you, every answer that it gives you, you have to check, because it could be just grossly inappropriate, making the stupidest mistakes that a 6-year-old wouldn't make. Okay. Another fanciful example of this, I'll quit today and I'll finish it up tomorrow. Let's imagine that I go back in time 200 years and I have an MP4 with some music on it. This music is produced by what they used to call a synthesizer, an artificial keyboard. And I took along with me a couple of portable speakers. Talking to people 200 years ago, and then I press a button and the music goes on, and it's playing violin music. Synthesizer, violin music. So the people are, what is that? How did you do that? And I say, what do you mean? How did you get people into that box? And violins? How did you do that? It's a very small box. How did you cram people in there? Listen, there aren't any people in there. Oh, yes, there are. You can't tell us. We know what violin music is. We know how you produce violin music. You play a violin, and people do that. Just how did you get them in the box? What kind of pygmies do you have in there? Listen, it's not being done by people at all. It wasn't done by people. And I must tell you, you can't even understand it if I tell it to you. You'd need a year's worth of education to bring you up to the point where you could understand the explanation for it. It's not being produced the way you think music is produced at all. It's done in an entirely different way. So that's to loosen up your mind, so that when we say that Kadosh Baruch Hu doesn't lack any of the abilities that knowledge would give you, that doesn't mean he lacks any. That doesn't mean that he has knowledge. He doesn't lack the abilities, because he can do all of the things that knowledge enables you to do, but not using what we call knowledge. It's some other aspect of his being which we can't describe at all. So that's the way the Rambam explains the facts about knowledge. But as I say, tomorrow we'll have to talk about how does the Rambam understand all of the literature in which God is described? If we can't describe him, what is that literature about? We'll talk about that tomorrow.